And now we arrive at Psalm 4. We've looked at the first three Psalms and the connections between the Psalms, and especially the first two and how well they create this introduction to the Psalter. And what we've been seeing is how self-referential these first couple of Psalms are with each other. And that's what we are going to be continuing today. And Psalm 4 is sometimes referred to as the evening psalm. Last time we looked at Psalm 3, which is sometimes referred to as the morning psalm. And as you can see here, there's a rough chiastic structure with it. It begins and ends with prayers. The enemies are addressed in verses 2 through 3, and the enemies respond in verse 6a. And that puts at the center the proper response to Yahweh in verses 4 through 6. Now, believe it or not, the very beginning is going to have something rather noteworthy here. It reads, "To the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm of David." And what's of note here is this term, this language of choir master. In other contexts, like in 2 Chronicles 2:2, it refers to the overseers, the people that are in charge with construction. And so generally this term just means something like that. It's someone in a preeminent position. And because of the musical context in the header of the psalm, choir master is usually the way it's going to be translated. However, in the ancient translation of the LXX, for some reason in the Greek, they translated it for the end or something to that effect. So Hamilton, commenting on this language, he said, "Given David's role in the reformation of Israel's worship, organizing singers, providing psalms, and leading in worship." And we looked at this in detail in First Chronicles 23 through 27. I have a video on that you can check out. Continuing, a translation along the lines of "for the preeminent one," that's Hamilton's translation, might not be far off. In that case, there may be a nod in the direction of the promised seed of David, who will lead Israel in battle and in worship as his ancestral namesake did. So, in other words, it has this eschatological feel, this messianic feel to it. And this commentary by Hamilton is from 2021, so it's rather recent, but roughly 1800 years ago, Origen more or less made the same point. He wrote, "Therefore, since Christ is referred to as David, the Psalms that are titled for the end," and he's talking about the Greek translation here, "announce the end and victory of Christ. Victory is granted to each one who is conquered by Christ. He overcomes the evil happening to him, and he is lifted from its midst as he is subjected to Christ. For Christ conquers no one who is unwilling, but by persuasion, since he is the word of God." So Origen wasn't a Calvinist, as we can see. "Truly, since not only the songs of David, but also of Asaph, and even the sons of Korah, are titled for the end, it is not absurd for us to understand this is written about all the saints who receive the image of Christ." Looking at verse 1, "Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer." And some of this language is rather interesting. Hamilton writes in his commentary, what is typically rendered along the lines of, "You freed me from affliction," or in the ESV's case, "You have given me relief when I was in distress," can be more literally rendered, "In the tight place you made it broad for me." The lexical connection between the tight place and the adversaries or foes in verse 3:1 joins with the natural effect of reading the two psalms in sequence to give the impression that the Psalm 4:1 rehearsal of the way Yahweh brought out the constricted difficulty David experienced refers to the deliverance from Absalom celebrated in Psalm 3. But simply put, more intertextual echoes between these two psalms. And continuing with Hamilton, he writes, "David calls on the Lord in 4:1 to be gracious to him and hear his prayer. Number 625 invokes Yahweh's grace on his people, and David prays for that grace here at the beginning of Psalm 4. Later in Psalm 4, David will pray for the number 626, lifting up of Yahweh's face upon his people. That's in verse 6, which connects back to the Psalm 3:8 plea for Yahweh's blessing to be on his people. The blessings of Psalm 3 and 4 harken back to the blessing on those who take refuge in the Davidic king at the end of Psalm 2:12, a blessing enjoyed because the king himself is blessed. It's really interesting, and this is really what we've been looking at, is how densely connected all of these psalms are so far. And so this little verse here is going to connect us back to the first three psalms rather neatly And it's worth checking out those videos, but just briefly here, this idea of the blessed man, we argued was the Messiah, which of course is picked up again in Psalm 2. And the people are taking refuge in this Messiah. Of course, we also noted there that you normally only take refuge in the Lord, but that makes sense if the Messiah in Psalm 2, in Psalm 1 by extension, is divine, if he is the God man. So are you taking refuge in the Davidic descendant, the Messiah, or are you taking refuge in the Lord? And the answer is yes, they're both the same thing. Now down to verse 2, O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? And our first, Selah. And literally here, this language here of vain words is empty. These are empty words. And this links us back to Psalm 2:1. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? So the same terminology used there. And we have a good quotation here by Chrysostom. I want to pick up the one by Augustine here. He writes, You are seeking gold because you imagine you will be happy with gold, but gold does not make one happy. Why seek after lies? Why do you want to get to the top of this world? Because you imagine you will be happy with honor from people and worldly triumphs. But worldly triumphs do not make one happy. Why do you seek after lies? And whatever else you may seek after here, when you seek it in a worldly way, when you seek it by loving earth, when you seek it by licking the dust of the earth, the reason you are seeking it is in order to be happy. But nothing at all that is of the earth will make you happy. What you are seeking is deceptive. What you are seeking is lies. And this psalm has been deeply in my mind as of late, and especially this concept here. Somewhat recently, I was having a discussion with somebody, and it ranged all over the place. We had a lot of topics. One of those topics we hit was marriage. And they said that there are couples that are not serving the Lord or whatever that are happy. And in the moment, I couldn't disagree with that, but it didn't sit well with me. I was thinking about that after the conversation. And after I read these quotes by Chrysostom and Augustine, I think what finally clicked with me is that I think what people like that have is they have pleasure. Nobody's saying an ungodly person can't have pleasure. In fact, they can have plenty of it. The problem is just a purely hedonistic pleasure that's very self-serving. It's going to dry up at some point. I mean, biblically speaking, you have that concept, the pleasure of sin lasts only for a season. It is pleasurable, but it's going to go away at some point. So if all of your so-called happiness is tied to pleasure, the pleasure you get from whatever it is, from a relationship or a job or money or whatever, it's going to eventually dry up. And do you have happiness? And that's the thing that we've been seeing through these first three Psalms is that happiness. Again, this is back to the very beginning of Psalm 1. Happy or blessed is the man. The only true happiness you have, the only true blessedness that you can have in this world is to take refuge in the blessed man, in the Lord, in the Messiah, in Christ. That's the only way that through all of life that you're going to continue to be happy. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about and trying to apply to my life as life has gotten really crazy personally as of late, but sermon over, and we'll just keep moving on. Verse 3, but know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. In Reardon writes, the Hebrew term here translated as godly is Hasid. That is to say, the life in Christ is the life of the holy ones, the Hasidim. It is the Hasidic life, the life of separation from the sinful standards of the world. One cannot live a worldly life and still expect to be able to pray the Psalms. This separation of the godly for the service of the Lord is likewise the source of the conflict that we find all through the Psalter. And we've been seeing that in the first three Psalms, especially. Thus said the blessed man, who is the key to the Psalms. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. And that's John 15, 18, and 19. And this quotation here in John is really the lens that you could see these first four Psalms through, because that is exactly what it's hitting on, is this juxtaposition between the godly and the ungodly, or the way of the Lord and the way of the wicked, things like that. Such are the Christological dimensions of the conflict that we have seen in each of the first four Psalms. And Hamilton, in his commentary, pointed out that the godly here, he translated this as the loving kind one. The Lord has set apart the loving kind one for himself, because he wanted to bring out the resonance with Hesed. So you have Hesed. But continuing with Hamilton's commentary, he has a nice summary of these first couple Psalms. Reading Psalm 4:3 in light of what has been said to this point in the Psalms, Yahweh has set him apart by planting him next to Torah streams of water. 1:3, by installing him on Zion. 2:6, decreeing his reign. 2:7 through 9, being his shield and glory and the lifter of his head. 3:3, hearing his prayer. 3:4, sustaining him. 3:5, and shattering the teeth of his enemies. In 3:7, all this shows that this man belongs to Yahweh, that Yahweh has chosen him and set him apart for himself, and it guarantees that Yahweh will continue to hear his prayer. Down to verse 4, be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Selah. Barbiero here is pointing out some of the resonances with Psalm 2 because sometimes this is translated as something like tremble and do not sin or something to that effect. And so that trembling would create some resonances with 2:11 and 2:12, the trust language. But I really like this quotation from Diodor of Tarsus. It reminds me of the C.S. Lewis quote. And Lewis, of course, was writing in the 20th century. But whatever this is, 1600 years earlier or whatever, you have Diodor saying more or less the same thing. But C.S. Lewis used the analogy of dentist. He was responding to people with the mindset that God wouldn't let anything bad happen to them, wouldn't allow discomfort in their life. And he said, have these people never been to the dentist? And here Diodor says, it is better to submit to the one who is aware and capable of everything. After all, if we allow surgeons to burn and cut the sick person on account of their skill and do not get upset at their art despite the pain of the operation, how much more when we fall foul of more grievous and trying events that God, like a skillful surgeon, either applies to us or allows, like burning or the knife, do we not submit to such great skill by convincing ourselves that he does everything for our benefit, especially since nothing but good was likely to happen? So are you angry? He asks. Do not sin. And moving down, Labuschagne points out here, we're not going to do a lot of the Gematria stuff this time, but Labuschagne points out here that the 5 words in 4b constitute the consciously devised meaningful center, which coincides precisely with the middle colon. In addition, it is demarcated and emphasized by the 2 imperatives. So the center of the psalm is meditate in your hearts on your beds and be silent. So again, the 2 imperatives, meditate and be silent. Verse 5, offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. The Blackwell Bible commentaries say the presence of God in his sanctuary in 3:4 also has an echo in 4:5 with reference to the offering of sacrifices. So just another connection back to Psalm 34. Also of note is the fact that these 2 words, offer and sacrifices, are more or less the same term. So you could say something like offer right offerings. And even this term here, right, that goes all the way back to the first verse. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. So if you wanted to bring out all of the resonances, you might translate it something like offer righteous offerings. I realize that sounds odd and kind of redundant, but that would connect all the things that the psalmist is trying to connect. Moving down to verse 6, there are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. And I always thought that this was one of the oddest verses in the Psalms. I'd memorized up to about Psalm 15 or so. And this verse always stood out to me as just sounding odd. But after consulting a number of commentaries, I think that it's actually a really interesting verse. The first order of business, though, is the fact that most translations are going to put the quotation at the end of this line, the quotation mark here. This obviously isn't in the original Hebrew, but it makes more sense to put it here. Some translations put it here, some put it at the end after lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. The reason why that's important, though, is we're going to see that this line here is kind of a negative line. These are the enemies of David saying something like this. And then it makes more sense to see this as David's response to those people. So Hamilton will give us a good lay of the land here. He says, the first words of 4:6 are an exact repetition of the first phrase in 3:2. Many are saying. This would indicate that the kind of thing being said in 4:6 is the kind of thing that was being said in 3:2. Those who would assert that God was not going to save David in 3:2 are the kinds of people who would ask who would cause the people to see good. The assumption here is that David will not cause them to see the kind of good they long for. And this indicates that though David has given them true and good counsel, in 4:3-5, that counsel has not been received. And this is the part, though, that has really resonated with me as of late. Because as we've seen, these first couple of Psalms really are ultimately about the Messiah. They're ultimately about Christ. And so there's this blending of the people rejecting or attacking David. And by extension, they're really attacking the Messiah. They're attacking Christ, which is an attack on God. But thinking through that lens, the assumption here is that the Messiah, we'll just put it that way, will not cause them to see the kind of good they long for. So that's what this phrase is getting at when it says this. Who will show us some good? And the reason why that's been like floating around in my mind as of late is, again, this juxtaposition between the godly and the ungodly. That's all over the early part of the Psalter and really throughout the Psalter. But like on a personal level, it's something I've been thinking a lot about. I've had Christians, and usually the Christians are a bit more subtle about this, but I've been more or less asked why I care so much about this kind of stuff. And I don't mean like the YouTube thing. I mean like ministry and faith, taking it so seriously. And I've had others that they're not antagonistic towards the faith, but they're just not really believers in any meaningful sense. And I've had some of those people just flat out say, you seem like a smart person. Why are you doing this? You should have been a doctor. You could have been a lawyer. Why waste your time on this? And it's exactly this mindset. These people long for something. In many ways, again, what we saw earlier with Augustine, they long for the things of this world. They long to get on top in this world, to get ahead in this world. And is that really the point of life, though? Is that really going to bring you happiness? And not that there's anything wrong with any of those things necessarily, but it's how are you pursuing these things that I think is the important part. But that's one of the biggest challenges that I have personally. It would be very easy to turn my back on all of this stuff and pursue all sorts of other things. But I know I'm not supposed to. And the doubt in my head, as well as people sometimes in my life, will be that voice that's asking me, who will show us some good? Is serving God actually going to bring any good in your life? Things like that. It's like that's my greatest challenge. And that's what I've been dealing with a lot lately. But continuing with Hamilton, he says David responds to the skeptical rejection of his rightful authority by crying out to Yahweh, asking him to cause Israel to experience the blessing of Aaron from Numbers 6:26. And this is, the Lord bless you, keep you, may his face shine upon you, be gracious to you. David petitions the Lord to lift up the light of his face upon his people. And just as Numbers 6:26 ends with a wish for Yahweh to give peace to his people, David will say in Psalm 4:8 that Yahweh causes him to lie down and sleep in peace. David, the king from Judah's line, prays for the people in the words of Aaron, anticipating the Psalm 110 king who will be priest. So that's the whole messianic priest after the order of Melchizedek, all of that kind of stuff. But this is anticipated all the way back in Psalm 4. Moving down to verse 7, you have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. And I'm not going to work through all of this, but this is from Botha's article. And he's pointing out more of this imagery, like the grain, wine, harvest imagery, brings us back to the chaff, the fruit imagery of Psalm 1. And then closing out with verse 8, in peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. And Wilcock in his commentary says, Psalm 3, he sleeps and reawakens. Here he lies down again to sleep. And the two Psalms may be contrasted as a morning prayer and an evening one, but each is a cry to God which expects an answer. And you will see this in kind of like liturgical traditions. The morning Psalm of Psalm 3, evening Psalm of Psalm 4. And I'm pointing out here that Yahweh, who sits or dwells in heaven, also enables his anointed to dwell in security or safety here, right? So this language of dwell, it's rather interesting because it brings back to mind Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor, and you could translate it this way, dwells in the dwelling of scoffers. Now, of course, again, we find out that the anointed one, the blessed man, dwells in heaven. He sits in heaven. So he doesn't dwell with the wicked because the Messiah conquers and overcomes and sits, dwells in heaven. He allows us, believers, to dwell in safety, in peace. And I also point out here that there's perhaps a resonance with Deuteronomy 33:28, which has a lot of the same vocabulary. It says, so Israel lived in safety. Jacob lived alone in a land of grain and wine, whose heavens dropped down dew. So the grain and wine language brings back to mind verse 7. But once again, I will upload the notes to Ko-Fi or something so you guys can download it and take a look at it. and I will see you guys next time.